I'm certainly not quite won over by the argument that we should have civil servants declaring their political beliefs, not least for the fact that our political beliefs change over time. And this is also an institution that's supposed to be impartial and in theory, independent of politics. But I think the Raab case is interesting in a way for another reason. In my eyes, at least, it's showing us that I think within the civil service, there's clearly evidence that it's morphed into what we might call a culture of victimhood, that essentially some of the complaints that were levelled at Dominic Raab, having read the report, having read his response over the weekend, it's quite clear in my mind that these are often not what you would classify as quote unquote bullying. And I think this is where we are now as a society. Minor transgressions, so-called microaggressions, slight offence are all taken as evidence of a much broader character trait. And I don't think that's a particularly great place for any institution or society to be. And the last point I'd add here, Ellie, is if you look at the response to Raab's departure from across the political spectrum, on the right, on the left, in the middle, the consensus today seems to be that maybe he shouldn't really have gone at all. And that, I think, is a remarkable state of affairs.
I mean, it does seem a bit of a... I can see the argument that is being made with all of this, but they're also saying, politicians, ministers should be able to pick their own. I mean, you'd only end up picking people who fundamentally agree with you, wouldn't you? Which actually, in the great scheme of things, doesn't help the political process or the practical side of the political process.
Yeah, I don't think having, political beliefs as some kind of protected characteristic is the way to go here. Because if you do that in the civil service, you'll probably have to do it in every other public organisation. How do you measure it? What happens when people change their views over time? I mean, it just becomes incredibly complex. The other issue alongside that, by the way, is that we need to get back to a civil service that actually does its job and doesn't leak constantly against ministers. I've been quite struck by the extent of leaks and what we might call, unorthodox, unprofessional behaviour within the civil service ever since the Brexit referendum. I've always been taken aback at how many stories refer to civil servants leaking information about negotiations and so forth. So there are questions to ask about the civil service, but I don't think asking civil servants to declare their political beliefs, their political ideology is the way to go.
And where do you think this row leaves the relationship between civil servants and ministers? Because there was this war of words, wasn't there, between Dominic Raab and the union that represents civil servants. Dominic Raab suggesting that perhaps civil servants can attempt to block policy, and civil servants coming back and saying that's a dangerous conspiracy theory. Where do we go from here?
Well, at the end of 13 years of Conservative government, I think relations are pretty poor, certainly pretty shaky. I think one of the interesting remarks that Raab made in his departure was this notion of cultural resistance, which is the idea that whatever he was trying to do within the civil service was either getting diluted or blocked. And he's not the first person to make that argument, of course. Lord Frost, David Frost, has made a similar argument in the past, and Conservative ministers often feel that there is a sort of ideological orthodoxy that works against them. Now, are those the complaints of disgruntled Conservative ministers, or do we have a problem within an institution that is overwhelmingly dominated by members of the elite graduate class who, as we know from the data, have tended to be moving leftwards on lots of cultural issues over the last decade or so?